All right, gang. Let's get into talking about some of this art. So, just a refresher for the viewers, it's basically art that each of the panelists picked, just something that inspires them. Did a little bit of homework in terms of the artists and talking about them, and basically, just for all you guys, we'll let panelists speak first, then we'll just kind of open it up. There is like 27 slides total, so we'll try to keep it about 5 minutes per artist if possible.
Sure.
We'll just go with it, but I just want to say that out there. All right, so up first we have Alexander Ross.
Okay. All right. So kind of one of the things I wanted to do with my discussion of like kind of artists that influenced me was talk a little bit about how, influence comes in more forms than just what it looks like. It's not just necessarily an artist's mark making or color schemes they use or even their subject matter. So that's what I kind of wanted to get at a little bit, at least with two of the artists. So Alexander Ross, along with the other artists that I'll talk about in a second, was an artist that I discovered when I was in art school, and I don't know, something about like this. I probably saw his work on one of the many art blogs that I was on at that time. Like art blogging was still like a really big thing in the early 2010s. So I followed like a ton of art blogs, and I'm pretty sure his work popped up in one. And I was just really drawn, specifically visually, I was really drawn to like the kind of textures that he creates. I mean, you probably see like a lot of this like really kind of trypophobic stuff that he does kind of appear in my work. Yeah, I love that. Like I had a buddy in grad school who could not look at this guy's paintings because it triggered his trypophobia. And I love that. And like it can actually have such a real effect on people. But the other thing that was really interesting about him to me was that he was very much into the science of biology as like a subject matter. Like he's very interested in the biological sciences. He's very interested in science as a subject matter for art. And so when I was in like art school first starting, I was 30 years old. I had a degree in biology, and I was kind of struggling to find my place a little bit. And so any artist that had a connection to science was an artist that I was really interested in, and his work spoke to me more than some of the other artists I had looked at up to that point. Because I got to art school and I'm like, I'm interested in science. And everyone's like, oh, look at Alexis Rockman. And I look at Alexis Rockman and his work's interesting. He's one of those guys that I went to see him talk, and it was one of the worst artist talks I've ever been to. He did a penny stamps lecture, and it was like, you're expecting, like, he's such a, like, he does murals for museums and things like that. And it was such one of those things where it's like, you're expecting to get some really interesting insight into the work. And it was like, there's nothing there. His whole artist talk was like, and then I painted this. And then we moved and I got married and now I painted this. And then we moved here and then I started painting this. And then I did this piece for this museum. And then I did it was just like and then I did this artist talk, which is not very interesting. So someone like Alexander Ross really actually I found to be a bit more interesting because it's both the kinds of things he's painting, but also his process. So if Lee, if you'll go back really quick.
Yeah.
And it's maybe just one of the last things that I'll say about him before we move on to one of my other artists. The painting that's in the upper right, that kind of weird face. So he has done like he does a lot of things. Like most of the pieces that you're seeing are like color pencil and ink and gouache and watercolor on paper. He does a lot of works on paper. But he also does oil paintings, and the oil paintings are really interesting because he basically gets like plasticine and like sculpts all these things with plasticine first, creates these milieus. He then photographs them crazily. He then edits the shit out of them in Photoshop so that they become. He basically creates like a posterization effect on them. It runs that through Photoshop, prints them out, and then paints from the print. The photographic print. So there's this long process of basically like translation from what the original thing was to the final thing that gets painted. And I really thought like things like processes like that were really interesting to me, that kind of run the subject matter through like a number of like artistic filters basically. So his process was really interesting to me as well. The way he's like kind of in dialogue with the way that scientific like information is kind of processed and then communicated.
Is he working now?
Yeah, he's still around.
Okay.
Yeah, I just checked his website. He's got works up on his website up through 2021 right now.
That piece in the top right corner is more current than the other pieces you selected, right?
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of the pieces that the works on paper are some of his older work. I've seen like paintings like this. He's done quite a number of paintings like this. I've seen those at Expo Chicago. He's one of the galleries that he shows with, usually has a booth at Expo Chicago. So we used to go every year when I lived in South Bend. So I've seen his work in person. It's really interesting. Very, very cool. But that's Alexander Ross. Interested in him because of his connection to science. And I was kind of trying to find my place in art school as a 30-year-old art student who was interested in science. So if you want to go to whoever you've got next.
No. Let's have people talk about it. So
okay. Yeah, go ahead.
These are gorgeous, and they definitely, especially like the cell wall stuff in the next ones, but like the ones on this slide are so organic, but they're very much like, they definitely give me like strong like lichen kind of vibes, which like I think if I remember correctly, I think lichen is a composite organism, so it's neither fungus nor like plant. It's like a weird, but I don't know. This is just such like a fun, like imagined kind of thing that builds off of like real. And there's something like kind of really nice to, because you get a lot you can kind of hold on to with that, because you bring sort of your own like life experiences to whatever you're looking at, and so especially with something as amorphous as this, you can kind of like project your own stuff onto it in a way that's like really rich and kind of brings your own narrative or whatever to it, which is kind of fun.
He's very much like kind of abstracting.
Also, the colors are just really nice.
Yeah, no, he's got such a great color sense. Really, really does.
I think this kind of speaks to your own work, Lucas, in the sense of the kind of texture I'm seeing in Ross's work is somewhat akin to the texture I see in your own. Actually, I've got it right here. I've been listening to this a lot lately.
Thank you.
Tons of texture, right? It's hard to see. This kind of blurry. I'm focusing. Lots of texture in that, and I'm seeing a lot of that in Ross's work too. And maybe that's just partially not just the influence of Ross, maybe some of the artists you're looking at, but also maybe your experience with your previous study. You know?
I mean, he is an artist. I think kind of influenced me or pushed me to kind of see like the like biology references that I have from my bachelor's degree in a different way than I was originally seeing them. Like it was a totally different way to approach that same stuff, and like absolutely like a lot of my obsession with texture kind of honestly starts with Alexander Ross and seeing like how texture can really evoke a lot of emotion. Along with color, but if I'm working primarily in black and white, I'm kind of interested in seeing how just purely like texture can evoke a particular response. And so he's like one of those first people that kind of goes in my like reference bank of, I can totally take these kind of things. I can take these moves and add them to my list of moves. You know what I mean? That's always what you're doing is like you see a move and you're like, I want to add this to my list of moves.
I feel like this certainly adds to your toolkit as an artist because with ink work, I'm especially looking at your ink work. I think you tend to go to the basics like stippling, cross hatching, batch work. But when you look at these sort of cellular type of compositions, if you will, there's way more happening in it. And I think borrowing some of these textures and repurposing them in ink it just adds a lot to your own work, gives you more weapons to work with. But also, not just that, just looking at, because I'm unfamiliar with Alexander Ross, but when I look at his work, I don't think lichen or I don't think biology. That's not where my head goes. I think otherworldly fantasy realm. That's what I see. Even though maybe that's not the intent, that's how I'm interpreting it. It looks otherworldly. But if we went to an undiscovered planet, that's what I would see.
Yeah.
Kind of bouncing off of what Mark's saying, especially with the texture. This reminds me a lot of Fantastic Planet.
Yeah.
that
yeah.
animation style.
Yeah. It does.
It's got a very prog look. Again, this is a very lowbrow comment right now. It looks like a prog album cover, which I love. So that's fine. I'm actually kind of like taken aback by this because I'll be completely honest. When I saw the list, I thought you were going to talk about Alex Ross.
Yeah,
The
comic artist.
the comic book artist.
Who's also amazing.
Honestly,
It's also amazing, but this is great. No, this is awesome because I'd never heard of this before, and I think it's amazing. Yeah.
Very cool.
I had a couple comments. First of all, I love that his main headshot is like disappointed dad look in the bottom right corner. It's like I love that. Just for the panelists, I highly recommend doing the full screen for the presentation, just so you can see all the detail.
Good fucking call.
Please do that because it definitely helps. And then for the viewers, obviously do that too. And his use of like building kind of like maquettes, that process reminds me a little bit of like James Gurney, who does something similar when he's like building out things. And it's just like all that stuff just makes you so much more at peace when you're coming up with the final, because you figured out so many of the creative problems ahead of time. So I feel like that probably gives him a little bit more peace and comfort knowing he's just replicating what he's already created. But then obviously adding to the list.
I just say, or if you're a studio artist, it gives you opportunity to make new problems for yourself.
Yeah. I know.
Every step of the way, it gives you a chance to make a new complication.
Yeah, I know we talked about Adrian Cox briefly, but I know he makes maquettes that he then paints as these like weird, crazy, gloopy things. I know Will Cotton actually used to like, I don't know if he's still doing it, but he would like actually like make the candy headdresses. Like he learned to like make candy and macaroons and stuff.
Yeah.
Well, very cool. So we're doing a rotation where Caroline's going to be up next.
Okay,
so,
cool.
Sick. Who do we have?
We have...
Oh, okay. Sweet. Ana Mendieta. Okay, so briefly, Ana Mendieta, she's kind of like a pretty big deal feminist artist, mostly active in the 70s. She died somewhat young under somewhat mysterious circumstances, potentially murdered by her husband, who was acquitted. But the works of hers that I'm like most drawn to are from this series called The Silhouette. So Mendieta was a Cuban expat, kind of. Basically, like during the Cuban Revolution, she got kind of sent stateside with her sister to escape some of the political upheaval. And she faced a lot of like really fucked up like living circumstances, foster situations, and then in college she faced like a fair amount of discrimination for both her nationality, her race, and also for being a woman, because being a female artist in the 70s or now is like not the most easy thing to do. So a lot of her early work was very like bloody and visceral and about like sexual violence and stuff like that. So the Silhouette series, it's something that I encountered in college in one of the art history classes that I took. And they were sort of like, there are these beautiful photographs, right? But these photographs are effectively documentation of either like a performance or like a sculpture or something like that. But the photographs, I think, actually work as like these really incredible objects on their own. So the one in the center is like the first one of this series that kind of kicked off the body of work. And she was in Oaxaca in Mexico for like a project, and she's actually inside of like an archaeological site's tomb structure. And so she sort of was getting to this idea of like returning to the earth, but also sort of like getting that like primal sense of like femininity, like connecting back to the earth. But so she would make these silhouettes in like the actual earth of the places she was visiting. So they were like these sort of like earth forms. And then she would document the process of whatever the elements were that would kind of erode them at the time. So like the one on the left, you can kind of see it's like on a beach somewhere. So there are a series of kind of like the degradation of this particular object. But I also just thought like that these kind of function like interestingly as a self-portrait that's not really about the self-portrait. So she's sort of documenting her own self, but there's like an absence of the self and sort of like an erasure of the self, or like a unification of the self with kind of the larger earth or like cosmos, whatever. So there's like a big sort of like visceral kind of, I don't know. This was something where like I encountered it and initially sort of like written off this style of work as something that I wasn't interested in, but then I encountered Mendietta's take on this kind of thing and thought it was very engaging, but also just like you could kind of bring a lot of your own self to it in a way that I thought was really kind of rewarding in a way. So she was an interesting one to uncover. And I definitely strongly recommend just like reading a little bit more about the Silhouetta series in general and seeing like a couple of the other ones that she did, because she did them sort of like in a whole bunch of different geographies. She would like travel and like build them out of different things. There was, so like narrowing down the images that I sent was a difficult process. But
it's really, I think your point is pretty spot on too, where an artist usually in some way depicts themselves, sort of autobiographic in a way. Not all art that we express, but it can be. And I feel like this is like a great example of that. This kind of reminds me of something that you would see on like the 4AD album cover or like Dead Can Dance album cover. It has this sort of spirit to it, you know. There's sort of just like very just something very I don't know if visceral is the right word.
I would say that.
But it's I like that it's partially this is again where the art, yeah, it's crafted beautifully, yeah, it takes time to create these sort of scenarios, but it's a photograph, right? But it's also more about the philosophy or the story here in a lot of ways.
yeah.
Well, the art is a great vehicle for that story, but I feel like the story is probably the most important, like the meat of that piece.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like she's making deliberate reference to like indigenous, like earth goddess kind of practices. So like she remembered like encountering things like Santeria when she was growing up. But she like, and also like there was like the Taino indigenous like religious practices and stuff like that. So she was sort of talking about this as like a way of reconnecting with kind of that like ancestral kind of history that she'd been forcibly removed from as a child, but also like, you know, she's clearly bringing like her own, like there's a lot of rage in these that I thought was really kind of powerful and interesting. So
I think it's very interesting when you're given this background, because I've never heard of this photographer, and it's amazing what you're saying about them, but everything that you're saying, the background of it is kind of what I feel from it. I think visceral is a very good way of putting it. I find a lot of the images kind of unsettling, even though there's nothing offensive, you know what I mean, in them, but they're very tight shots. I don't know what it is. It's very, very compelling. It's really, really interesting stuff. Especially like if you go to the next slide.
Yeah, this one. Oh, I fucking love this one.
Like these
so unsettling.
It is, and in reality, there's no reason for it to be on the surface. But again, it's this really tight shot, and it doesn't shock me that you're a fan, because it's kind of this kind of contorted humanity that's being constructed. It's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing. Thank you for exposing me to this. I'm definitely want to check some more of this out. This is because it's just kind of creepy at the same time. I don't know why. You know, it just is. Yeah, it's really cool.
With Caroline, with your own work, there's like this sort of dynamic between aesthetics, beauty, and then ugly. Like there's something. I feel like this artist, Mendieta, is sort of rough. You know, you guys are kind of cut from the same cloth in a way. When you look at sort of the approach, they're different. I mean, a lot of your stuff's very illustrative. First, that's clearly photography, but the messages and the result, or I should say, the end result is very much akin to one another. So I can see why you this the appeal. You know, I can.
Yeah, I think to that point too. What's interesting about Mendietta's work to me, and I've seen her work before, is how, however the work is intended to function as performance, or however it was intended to function as like a durational or time-based like piece. The photographs to me are about trace. Well, the photographs they're about the trace, right? I mean, that's what they are. They're documenting essentially the trace, not just of like the performance, but whatever it is that's actually in the photo is a trace of something. And I think that's where we get like this sense of kind of overwhelming emotion, because we immediately try to infer what this is a trace of, right?
Yeah.
What this is an impression of, whether it is a human body, whether there is some of them could appear like they're shot in such a way that they also kind of look like crime scene photos, right? There's like
a lot of the other ones. Yeah. A lot of the other ones that I didn't include have this like you've stumbled upon a gravesite. And actually the first one where she's like she's actually present, she's covered in flowers, that is actually like a pre-Columbian tomb that she's like laying her body down inside of. And so
what strikes me about this being about the trace is like the sort of trace of some event, whether traumatic or not, kind of happening and essentially leaving its scar on the earth. I see that in your work, except instead of the earth, it's the flesh, right? There's the flesh is essentially indexed with all these traces, right, of visible traces of things that have happened to a person. So that's like one of the things I definitely like get to almost immediately with this when I see this.
Yeah.
Work.
I think sort of my like parting shots for why I think this is so interesting, and Lucas, you framed this perfectly, is that like with the photography aspect of this too, like a photograph is a distinct point in time. So you do start to like, your brain fills in like what's happened on either side of this. And actually the reason that I became exposed to Mendieta in the first place was because I was taking like a art history 1950 to the present class, or 1945 to the present. And I wrote about this this body of work in addition to Cindy Sherman's film stills as like sort of a single thing where like you're looking at like a single point in time and then like filling in the rest.
Yep.
And it's an unsettling process.
Mm-hmm.
Did you take that class because you knew you were going to be asked to be on this panel?
What's really fucked up is that like Anna is the only person from that class that I even remotely entertained putting in this conversation. That's a conversation for another time.
Cool.
A lot of dudes making paintings.
No, this is interesting.
Painting dead.
All right. And Jerry, what you got
Speaking of dudes making paintings.
A different brand of dudes.
Nice. Fair enough. Nice segue. So this is Enzo Schiotti. Again, when I talk about art influences and when I get asked about them, there's three areas: D&D, heavy metal album covers, and me walking through the horror section of the videotape store when I was a kid. I was born in '82, so most of the, especially from the '80s, '70s, and '80s, they were just hand painted. They were absolutely incredible. And then you get into the '90s, and you got the floating head digital collages, and unfortunately, it seems to be a lost art form. But Enzo Schiotti, I came upon because he did a lot of the Italian gore, Lucio Fulci, Dario Argento album covers, posters and the VHS boxes and stuff like that. He did a lot of stuff. It wasn't all horror. He did actually some of his action posters and comedy posters are even more incredible. Like this one, the one on the right is actually a movie called American Ninja 3, which is a very famous Cannon film. It's absolutely terrible. But I love, if you notice, he had, and there's another great one. His usage of aggressively using white light to separate things, and I think it's so amazing. The first one is from a movie called Night Riders. It's a George Romero movie. I'm actually not a fan of the movie, but I really love this poster. You can see the faint reflection on the bottom. There's so much from the movie that's there. And additionally, he wasn't afraid to leave a lot of empty space because he was a commercial artist. He knew that it was going to be filled up with information. And his portraits are great. I love the fact that the reflection of the hair with light, just is something that I always try to do. And the one on the right's for a movie called Maniac. And they actually remade that movie with Elijah Wood playing the killer, and he did the art for that one as well. I love the eyes. I love how, again, with the flesh, he's very aggressive with blinding white, not afraid to use it, and how he's able just to put it all there. And plus, painting a gun is really tough because it's very symmetrical, and he paints a lot of guns because of the movies he does, which I always thought was fascinating. And then the other one, of course, was I
was going to say was Army of Darkness.
Army of Darkness. And the funny part is that skull gets used for Evil Dead 2. He's kind of recycled that skull. Speaking of Ed Ripka, he kind of recycles that skull a lot. He's used that skull for a lot of different things. He repaints it. But yeah, Skull with Eyeballs is all over it. And of course, I love that movie. But again, it's just the blinding white light, and the one with American Ninja. If you ever can get his paintings, I love the sprawling landscape. I love the idea of the light shooting out, again, showing a lot of movement. A lot of his paintings just have a lot of movement, whether it's the hair, whether it's the light. Nothing ever seems just still. And it's just awesome. So I can't paint like him, but I always want to. And he's one of the main people I look to when it's like I don't know what the hell I'm doing. I just go to his stuff again because I also just have such an affinity towards people who painted movie posters. So
yeah,
well, I feel like this is a man who knew how to use an airbrush.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Maybe that's why it doesn't look like his. Maybe I got to start using airbrush. Yeah, but without a doubt. Although a lot of it was oil.
Just look at some of the decisions and like how they're painting on the right. Look at the decision to paint the man on the left facing side. His back is blue. It's painted blue.
Yeah.
Or the disembodied head of the woman, her neck is blue. You know, just it kind of defies that intuition that your gut tells you, oh, it's got to be the color of the flesh. You know, and I love that decision making because that blue is full throughout the entire piece.
Most of his stuff is pretty blue too.
Yeah, Ash's shadows. He's really leaning into those blue values in the bicep.
Yeah. You know what's interesting to me about these is, to Jerry, to your point about his use of light. What kind of strikes me about these is that they're actually the way he sets up an image and the way he uses light in an image is actually very cinematic. Like, it's appropriate that he's a movie poster guy, but not a lot of people who are painting movie posters have a cinematic eye. They may have an illustrator's eye, but these strike me as like a director might compose an image like this as much as he is. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like just the use of backlighting and things like that. They strike me as almost taking into account like a film set and how you would light things on a film set. So I find that really, really interesting about the work. I don't know.
There's multiple sources of light too. Yeah. It's not like, okay, well, it's just behind the motorcycle. Well, no, it's also going to be over here.
Yeah, which gets to like the cinematic. I mean, like, you know,
totally.
I think if you've ever tried to paint literally anything from life, unless you have like literally one single light source that you're training on something, like you're going to always have multiple light sources. And even if you do have the single light source, that single light source is going to reflect off of some different surfaces and like cast some other like light sources back onto some other sides. And like, I think he really gets at like the multiple light source and also the different colors that you get.
Yeah,
like he's really kind of punching that up, which is fun.
Yeah, I mean, very specifically, like on a movie set, like you would not just light something with one light source. You'd be like, all right, let's get a general light source. Let's put a spot here. Let's put another spot here. Let's get a pin light here so we get a certain reflection off something. Let's get a colored gel to get a particular thing. He's kind of thinking like that, which I find kind of fascinating.
Lucas, you what's that?
He doesn't literally have a lens flare going, but he has sort of like that feel
it's like the closest thing to not painting a lens flare. It's like he just shy of that.
It's not Excalibur movie poster is what you're saying. If you get the reference.
Yeah.
One thing that I'd actually be kind of curious. You know, in those days they work with typesetters, and I'm kind of curious if the typography was set before the painting took place, because if you look at the Army of Darkness, clearly the typography is going to sit in the upper right corner. Totally. Where the poster on the right, the typography is going to sit on the left facing side of the poster.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious if he had those specs of how the type was set, if they did the type setting first and then did the painting, or if he did the painting with, the intention for the logo to go. Was he making that decision, or was the movie production team, the art director, making that decision? You know what I'm saying?
Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago. Nor do I live in Italy to ask, But he has a couple art books that I have of his where it shows the drafts, and the drafts do have the typesetting in them.
Okay.
So I would assume that he probably had at least some relationship, at least some of the people, as to how it was going to be, which is the way that it should be, especially if you're doing a flyer or an album cover. It's always good to say, like, where you're going to put that, where's the information going, because you have to make sure. So yeah, I think he definitely had that in mind.
Can you imagine, you're now that's part of your composition. That typography, even though it's not on the painting, is dictating how your composition is going to be.
It's crazy.
To some degree. And to be able to defeat that and make something that still works on its own and
That's
without
crazy.
it's amazing, right?
Yeah.
It's a lost art.
Yeah. Definitely is, unfortunately, yeah.
Very cool. Yeah, last thing I was thinking on I forget what movie it was, but the one on the far right here, just the complexity and color
It's
around
American
those
Ninja
figures.
3.
Yeah. Like,
I know I've seen 1 and 2. I don't know if I've seen 3.
Oh, you're missing out. You're really not. It's
I
okay.
have to fill in my fill in that gap in my
in your letterbox.
Yeah. So cool. Well, artist I picked that I'm actually kind of a latecomer to finding.
It's my dude.
Yeah, but Philippe Drouet. So, Jerry, you probably know him more than I do, but just doing a little research. So, he's from France, and he was born in the early 40s. So, he's actually 79 years old right now. So, he is very much getting there. But yeah, a little bit about Drouet. I mean, he got his first, real kind of like illustration work when he was like 22, worked his way up. These pieces here are from this particular book. I don't know how to pronounce it. Is it Yargale? Do you know, Jerry?
You're on Gale.
But this is a Dragon's Dream Press from the 70s. Really, really nice book. I'm fortunate to have that. But I'm just, his shape language, the way he breaks things up with color, obviously all the detail and how ornate everything is, yet it doesn't feel stiff, I think is the beauty in his art, is that it feels dynamic, yet it's so intricate. And that's kind of what I always want to try to achieve, is having that balance. And his use of color and the way he blends everything, I mean, it's definitely one reason why I'm interested in getting a little more into acrylics and mixed media stuff. But yeah, it just speaks to me. I don't know how else to put it. It's like exactly what I want to try to accomplish with my own art. So he's going to be a big inspiration for me going forward, and hopefully I don't rip off him too bad. But yeah, he was one of the founders of the metal Hurlant magazine in France, which is known as Heavy Metal magazine in America. He basically partnered up with Mobius, Bernard Farkas, and Jean-Pierre Doyen. And he's still creating stuff today. So his Lone Sloan graphic novel series, he has an edition coming out later this year, I believe. Yeah. And I have most of them up until this point. I think the only potential slight for me with Drouet is I just feel like his art is a lot better than his storytelling. So I don't necessarily I think there's better comic writers out there for sure, but from an art perspective, he's as adventurous as it comes and definitely one of my favorites.
I dig that he sort of knows where to not, if that makes sense. Like, he's packing a lot of information into things, but he also knows where to let it breathe.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I'm really kind of enamored by I almost feel like the one on the left, for example. Well, actually, really all of them seem to have layers of composition, like where maybe it's the background, middle ground, foreground all have their own sense of complexity, but they all somehow are married really well together. Like the use of the negative space in the foreground on the one on the left with those ropes or whatever those wires are and stuff. It's just insanely well thought out. I'm not super familiar with this artist, so this is my first time seeing these pieces, and I'm actually pretty blown away by how complex they are. They're really good.
Yeah, I'm way newer to his work than I care to admit, man. But I've just
No,
been
you're good.
so
I'm seeing this for the
obsessed.
first time.
I just feel like he should be so much bigger. I don't know.
I dig the colors on the one on the right too.
Yeah.
Like he's obviously going for that like complementary color scheme, but he's like just off enough.
Yeah, there's a lot of gray in it still.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the interesting too with the use of it's not probably not an outer glow effect like you would get in Adobe Photoshop. I'm assuming you actually maybe airbrush that.
Yeah.
But
the airbrush returns.
Yeah, it's just interesting the texture he's created with the airbrush work, even just that, how that little piece on the top right with the white stripes kind of coming down off the edge is a nice touch, you know. It adds to the piece, letting some of that red show through still.
And the fully flat black hair.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's a deliberate choice.
Yeah.
So,
like knowing when to get flat and graphic with it rather than having to be rendered, you know.
Yeah, I think
I was going to say, like, Mark, to your point too, like the two pieces we were looking at before, like one of his really interesting ways of like creating a sense of hierarchy within the image is he's using, like, especially the one in the middle, the kind of big one in the middle, he's like using color to sort of separate the foreground, middle ground, and background, which like keeps an image that would be really, really visually overwhelming if it was black and white. It actually like helps it like separate a lot, like so you still are able to comfortably like move your eye around the image and not kind of feel overwhelmed by it.
Yeah,
and he's doing that also in this one on the left too. It's just with value more than color. He's kind of creating
pushing back that line work with a little bit of atmospheric perspective is like very effective at creating that sense of space.
Smart illustrating.
Mm-hmm.
I could definitely learn a little bit from that for sure.
Yes,
I mean, seriously, just buy one of his books and it's a masterclass. Like, it's amazing. Especially this one, I think has some of his most ambitious work.
The unpronounceable.
Yeah, Yargil
Yeah,
and the other thing is he
about pronouncing it correctly because I feel like that's not a real language.
It's like Irigel.
Yeah, I don't know.
Y is meant to be that Y is meant to be a vowel, not a consonant.
The thing is, he only does interviews in French, so I don't. Unfortunately, it was a little harder to get information on him than I would expect.
Especially considering he's still alive. Yeah.
Yeah, and he's pretty active on social media as well. Believe it or not, yeah, he runs his own account.
Yeah.
I actually go kind of way back with Droulet. Again, I've mentioned this a number of times. Heavy Metal Magazine is a huge part of my life. My dad used to buy it, and it was Skulls and Titties. So as a kid, I used to love it. And I hold the 1975 to 1985 years of heavy metal very special. In fact, my kind of table next to my desk is just comic book boxes filled with them. I read them all the time and I cherish them. And Droulet was one of the first like 6 with Kaza, Mobius, Bernie Wrightson, and all them. And his stuff in heavy metal is absolutely incredible.
It's trope making for a reason because it's fucking
awesome. It's kind of Mobius gets a lot of press and it's understandable as to why, but Droulet was equally on par with him. And I remember Droulet saying once that his anatomy was never as good as other artists, but he didn't care. He just wanted it to look the way that he wanted it to look. So if it doesn't look like an actual human being 100%, it doesn't matter. And also, if you look at his panel work and his heavy metal work, he didn't do a lot of paneling, which I like a lot for what I do with my comics. It was more, every page was more a piece than it was a 5-panel grid or something like that. So he's an absolutely incredible artist, yeah. I'll shut up now because I could talk about it for way too long.
Well, I mean,
he's
you know,
awesome. he's
I think that
amazing.
also is maybe why his stories sometimes can be a little hard to read because you're so drawn by the art. You know,
that's 100% true. Yeah, you're right. His stories were never the best compared to everyone else, but his art definitely was up there. It was amazing.
Yeah, I'm just blown away, and you guys can call me out if I'm copying too much of his style in my next stuff, but you just let me know.
I bite off of him all the time, so it's totally cool.
All right. All right, Mark.
Yeah. Okay. So this is my Aunt Lee.
Oh, no kidding. That's so
I was about to say, no shit. Like, you're serious, your aunt?
Yeah. So she's my biological father's half sister. so
check that out.
There is some blood relation here, but it's somewhat minimal. But I picked, just like Lucas, I kind of picked artists who I felt like made an impact on my own art experience and art pursuit, if you will. And my Aunt Lee, having her, she went to school in Washington D.C., which American University, which wasn't, it's not too far off from where I live and where I grew up. And so she'd come by on occasion with her boyfriend, my uncle Mike, Riddick, who I'll probably get into just a little bit here too. Anyhow, I try to do like a little timeline thing. I'll try to, instead of reading from my notes that I took, I'll just try to do this from the top of my head. But basically, she when she was going to school, she kind of got involved in meeting one of her classmates is working with her dad, who was like I guess a comic book artist and comic strip illustrator. She also held a couple jobs in the DC area, working for the radio, WTOP radio and CBS News, doing some illustration work. Her background is illustration and writing. She has a degree, or had she finished her degree in fine arts. And then she eventually moved out to San Francisco, California in the 70s, I believe, late 60s, early 70s, late 60s, I think. And she met up with Trina Robbins. Let me make sure I have her name right. Trina Robbins. And Trina introduced my aunt to the underground comic scene. So that she really took to that and started writing and illustrating. And let me get back to my notes. I want to make sure I try to paint an accurate picture here. But she worked with Trina and a group of other female artists to start women's comics, which was a kind of like a conglomerate of female illustrators who wrote about feminist concerns, gender, sexuality, including homosexuality and politics and other sort of like things that were, not as popular in the comic book scene at that time. And they started doing their own underground publications. So the Women's Comics was launched. They had a couple of publishers that they went through throughout its career, but it ran for a good number of years, and she contributed to some of those stories and illustrations. Then the 70s, she met up with my uncle Mike, who ran Starreach, which is a like one of the first fantasy graphic novels, I guess, from that time period, along with heavy metal and all those. And she started writing and illustrating a series in there. I think we have a picture of it, Stark's Quest, which is the one that's depicted in the middle there. She also worked on a kind of a fun thing in the 80s. She did a couple other things in the 70s too. Bear with me. I'm just trying to look at some of the images we have on here, but in the 80s she did a comic book called Preteen Dirty Jane Kung Fu Kangaroos. It's like a parody of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and Peter Laird did a little guest spot in comic book. So the reason why I bring this one up is because if you go to the next panel, Lee, the two of the characters were created and named after me and my twin brother.
Shut up. That's so cool.
So again, that's like one of those things when you have an aunt who includes you in their pub, something that they're working on. That to me, I just thought that was the quirkiest, funniest thing. This is in the '80s, early '80s. This is a little kid, so that was wild to me. And just having an aunt who, I could hand a comic book to and it'd come back signed by the artist. Because they she knew a lot of the artists in the scene, was always something that kind of stuck with me. Actually, I do have a couple of things I can share. Like this is one, for example. Art Adams signed it. It's one of the first.
Oh, nice.
That's amazing.
Oh my god, that's so cool.
Star Reach was it started out as a like a graphic novel comic book series that my uncle published, but it actually went on to be an agency where they represented other artists, and so some of those artists, illustrated for some of the comics I collected in my youth. So they would get those signed for us. She worked on a number of things. She wrote Unicorn Isle, which is a Warp Graphics publication. The folks who did ElfQuest.
Yeah.
And,
that's sick.
That's cool.
She did. Speaking of Vertigo, she did wrote Fault Lines, which is the Vertigo series.
With Bill Cobe too. That's
What's that?
wild.
Yeah.
With Bill Cobe, yeah. I don't know how to
yeah.
pronounce his name, but
Batman. She did a couple of Batman, some Wonder Woman stuff. And this is kind of amusing. She was featured in this book she gave to me when I was younger, called the Underground Comics Family Album. And so she's depicted in here. They did a little feature on her and her art. But what struck me as funny is because I remember my aunt telling me about this. Sometimes she'd do conventions, and she said that a few occasions George DiCaprio had a booth set up next to hers, and he ran a couple. Actually, he worked on a couple comics and ran a publishing house for a while, Underground Comics. And that little dude that he's holding up is Leonardo DiCaprio. so he had a babysit whenever he had to go do a signing or walk away or something. She'd have to babysit Leonardo for him while he had to step away for whatever reason. So it's kind of a funny little thing. But
that Shikalsky documentary was partly a Leo thing, right?
What's that?
The Shikalsky documentary.
Oh, I don't know if I've seen
is that guy? It was this like crazy Polish artist, but it was connected to the Underground Comics people.
Oh, really?
And because of that, it was connected to Leo DiCaprio.
Yeah, he might actually be in this book. I wouldn't be surprised. There's a plethora of artists in here and writers. I wouldn't be surprised if he's mentioned in here too. Let's see. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, dude, this is so fucking cool.
And yeah, I guess the thing she's most well known for is probably Pudge Girl Blimp, which was a series she wrote about this 17-year-old girl who would travel, who was I guess essentially hitchhiking to San Francisco. It sounds kind of autobiographical in a way, but it talked about like her trying to like lose her virginity and going through like sexual orientation crisis and all these things. So she worked on a lot of ultra feminist, ultra kind of like in some ways subject matters that push the envelope in that time period. And anyway, she's a really cool person. She's still living. She's about 77, I think, right now. She's still, I think, involved in some animation stuff and some digital comics and all that. But she's definitely like I would say big influence. So like I could give you an example. Like when I was running for the school treasurer in elementary school, she happened to be in town. She helped draw some of my campaign posters. And to be able to watch an artist just on a whim create something, it makes an impact on you.
Your aunt is my new hero. Like
you see that, and you want to learn how to understand how to do that too. It's very like a magical experience. You watch somebody create something from nothing. So she just, even though I only got to have a handful of experiences with her, she would regularly keep in touch, through letters and stuff like that during the holidays and all that. But just to have exposure to somebody who was involved in something that was creative and that she could find some success in it, I feel like, in a way was a role model for me in sort of a not a super intentional way, but just having it present, I think, kind of pointed me in a direction that helped me understand that, hey, I can do something too with my creativity, because I already saw her doing something with hers.
Yeah, your aunt's a badass.
Yeah.
100%. Like there's no other way to put it. Your aunt is a fucking badass. This is so cool. Also, like on the next page too, like the way that she's using panels is like she's like using them where it suits her needs, but also like recognizing where she doesn't necessarily need to use a panel in order to like create sort of like a cool narrative flow that's actually really dynamic, which is awesome.
There's definitely some grid breaking here and there.
Yeah. Hell yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome, Mark. Thanks for sharing.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, Lucas.
Okay. So David Trampier, not an artist that I discovered in art school. An artist that I've been looking at since I was probably 12 years old. So my uncle was really big into D&D in the 70s and early 80s, and he left his his advanced D&D player's handbook and Dungeon Master's Guide and Monster Manual in my grandmother's basement, which I promptly decided were my own as soon as I found them. And his artwork he's one of those artists that like I kind of come back to like all the time, because I mean, as a kid, he was probably one of the first artists I ever looked at recognizably for their style. Like, probably one of the first artists I ever recognized as having a style. Probably the second artist would have to be like Pusshead, but you know, that one's a little more obvious, I guess. But yeah, and he's got such an interesting biography, as in there's such a lack of it. He did a bunch of stuff for TSR in the 70s and 80s, and then literally disappeared off the map in the late 80s, and no one could find him until someone came across him in like 2002, I guess, and he was driving taxis. And they tried to commission him. People tried to commission him for work. He got his photo taken for like some local news interest magazine that was or a newspaper article that wasn't about him being an illustrator. The person didn't know who he was, just thought he was a local taxi driver. People recognized him from that photo and started contacting him, and apparently he got so pissed off about it that he would just basically tell people to fuck off when they would call him about artwork. He basically just stopped making art. That's the thing. It's like he made art up through the mid 80s and then just kind of basically stopped, as far as I can tell. So it adds a little bit of mystique. I didn't know too much about him until I got invited to join a Fans of David Trampier Facebook group by the artist Jeffrey Beebe. Didn't you guys remember the giant Trumpy the Rat balloon? That he designed that big fucking giant Trumpy the Rat balloon.
The one that's basically Scabby but Trump, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Fuck yeah.
So if you ever, just like a side recommendation, Jeffrey Beebe's artwork, Beebe, fucking amazing. Someone whose artwork I came across in grad school, he used to do stuff, it was basically like studio artwork, but it was all based on like D&D. So he would make like dungeon maps, but they would be full of like weird fucking like really, really like snarky, witty comments about the art world instead of like, he would picture people as monsters and things like that. He did a whole series of
definitely come across his work then.
He did like a thing that was basically like a monster manual, but of all his uncles. Like, it's pretty fucking cool. Like, his shit's really fucking cool. I started talking to him a few years ago, and he's like, "Oh, you love David Trampier too? He's like one of my favorite fucking artists. Here, join this Facebook group with me." That I like moderate. So I started learning a little bit about him, like about how there's like not much about him, you know, to kind of find out. But really, I mean, just one of those artists who like was elevated above every other artist that was in that early like D&D kind of publishing realm. I mean, absolutely impeccable fucking like line work and hatching.
I love the mouth on the wall.
Yeah, and then he was a painter too. So he's like paintings like, I mean, that's also the the speaking mouth spell from D&D is what that is. But yeah, I don't know. Just there's not much to say about it from an intellectual perspective. He's just an artist that like has stuck with me because I encountered him when I was so young, and I when I think of fantasy art, I think of him more than anybody else. To be honest with you, like something about his style just kind of grabs me on an emotional level.
Kicks ass.
Yeah,
Like the light in the speaking spell one.
Yeah, he knew what he was doing in a way that a lot of the other early like 70 like those artists that were working for TSR in the 70s, a lot of them did not have the incredible chops this guy had.
And that's Lucas, that's what I was going to say. The amazing thing about Trampier is you really have to compare his work with what was being produced around the same time as him, because you can look at some of the stuff that he did at TSR and be like, okay, from today's standards, but compared to what everyone else was creating, it's pretty amazing.
Like David Sutherland and some of those other guys.
Yeah, and it's nothing against them. I mean, but his was leaps and bounds. And apparently, from what I had read, the reason why he left the industry was because of what TSR was doing with his art and the rights, and he left on very bitter terms and wanted nothing to ever do with it ever again. So, but you're right; it's so hard to find any information, and just that one painting image, of course, of the thief stealing the jewel from the eye. I mean, that's iconic. Anyone who plays D&D knows that. I mean,
I had that book somewhere. That's why I ran off for a second to see if I could.
I got it over here. What are you talking about?
I got mine right over there.
Yeah,
I literally had them out today, actually.
Somewhere.
Yeah, that's cool that because I wasn't super well versed in this artist at all, but just look at the descriptions. See, look at the cast shadow on that wall. How those bricks are hatched and the rest are not. That's awesome.
Okay.
You know what I mean? Like I want to.
He's making really smart choices.
Oh hell yeah!
I don't know where it is.
It's amazing how many different types of hatching are just in that one piece.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. No, the pen work is
stylized.
It's stylized, and yet it like reads like every texture has a different feel to it. Yeah. There's a great sense of light throughout the piece.
Yeah. Look at that light.
It's just the patience that would go into inking something like this. Like, fuck. Mm-hmm. It's one of those things I just look at him like, nah, if I'm ever that good, I would, I will die somewhat contented.
It looks like he tried to draw every hair on the horse.
Well, it's like the horse is like done, like hatching is almost like puzzle pieces. It's super weird.
It's really weird.
But it fucking works.
Yeah, it does.
The lizard too, for sure. Like just all these different hatching varieties, and it's so different than the one on the right there. Like it looks like a completely different artist.
Yeah. No, his paintings were very different from his drawings. He had like the monster or the player's handbook cover is like a very different kind of painting than it's a classic, but some of the paintings that appear inside the books, they are like a lot looser and more textured application of paint.
Yeah.
There's a couple of other paintings of his that are in these books that are, I was surprised to find out they were him as well. And then kind of not, because I'm like, well, they're also like really well done. They're very imaginative too. Like, this is what I think of when I think of playing D&D. I think of like being in a dark dungeon like that, carrying a fucking torch. So.
And he had one of the best signatures.
He did his fucking. Well, he had like 5 different fucking signatures, and they were all.
Yeah, but it's all about that DAT.
Yeah,
that's when you knew you had the good shit when you saw the DAT
Would you
next
say that
to
it's
it.
all about DAT.
It's all about DAT.
It's all about DAT.
It's all about DAT.
I was talking with Daniel Sawblade a couple weeks ago, and he's really influenced by the Realm of Chaos, like kind of the 80s handbook. Yeah. Do you guys have a copy of that at all? Like,
somewhere. I got a lot of shit, man.
I'm looking to like buy one.
One out
at
here.
least 100 for the reissue. Well, Mark's going to get it. But yeah, the Ian Miller art and
Oh,
Yeah,
fuck yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Now you're
I gave
speaking.
mine away to Dylan Jones from the band Rotted. He has my Warhammer book. I give it to him
Ooh.
because he's diehard into that stuff.
Giving away that grim dark lore.
Yeah. Oh, but yeah, Daniel's a cool dude, man. Actually, I think I'm gonna be talking to him tomorrow.
Nice.
Yeah.
Good.
I'll have that episode up. Well, by the time this airs, it'll probably be up by then.
Sweet.
All right.
Yeah, I have
What about oh, go ahead.
Sam
my
Saville.
copy from fucking high school. Anyway, sorry.
You're good. I know that Lucas knows who Jenny is, but I suspect that this is probably new to everybody else. So Jenny Saville, she's a British painter. She's only about 50 now. She came to prominence in the early 90s, mid 90s. Basically, she like graduated from undergrad, and Charles Saatchi like bought all of her work, which is weird and like whatever, but she actually like really deserved it. She came up at the same time as like Damien Hirst and all of them, and was sort of like loosely associated with them without actually like being one of them. Partly because she
just tell me what the significance that is, because I don't know.
Oh, okay. So Damien Hirst is one of the top selling artists of all time. Like, will sell things for like hundreds of millions of dollars at auction, and most of it is like stupid garbage.
It's one of the YBAs.
Yeah, so he was one of the YBAs was what it was called, as Young British Artists. Jenny Saville was technically one of the YBAs, but the YBAs was a fairly male-dominated group. Jenny Saville herself was kind of one of a very few figurative painters in her sort of cohort that were actually women. Most of the figurative painters at that time were men, very much painting from the male gaze. Jenny Saville was like, what if? And so she's painting these just massive scale, really like sumptuous paintings. So like, yeah, so you can get a sense of the scale here. Like these are big fucking paintings. And she talks a lot about like how sort of flesh and oil paint kind of are like the perfect complement to one another. So the one on the left is sort of like a hybrid portrait of her and her sister. If you go back one, so the images that I initially sent Lee are mostly adhering to the rule. The only exception is the blue one. The blue one was like 2004, I want to say, but everything else is prior to 2000. But she was looking at sort of challenging the idea of what beauty really was, because beauty was so often defined by sort of like the male gaze. And she was like, I don't know, I just kind of want to draw bodies and paint them. And she spent a lot of time around like morgues and plastic surgeons, and a lot of her like early stuff was this like really big work looking at these sort of like very large women. So there was like a whole like look at sort of like plastic surgery and like bodies as sort of like massive things and things like that. So there was like a lot of kind of redefining what the gaze looked like. But she's also like straight up looking at like murder victims at certain points, and like bodies in literal morgues. She actually like did a sort of fellowship in the United States where she shadowed a plastic surgeon. Like, but the way that she uses color and like the way that she just like paints the actual faces of things, like there's like a sculptural quality to it that I thought was really amazing. Mm-hmm. And like, she's one of those people where like, when I discovered her in like early like undergrad, I just was so taken with her work, and just like fucking like, this was one of the first art books that I bought for myself. So she's still working, she's still doing like a lot of beautiful stuff. I don't know if she still is, because I think Yayoi Kusama might have overtaken her, but for a brief period she was the most expensive woman artist who's still living to sell work at auction. Which, given that she's also like a figurative artist, and like I know Lucas talked about this a little bit, and the final artist that I have, Charles White, definitely, if we get there, sort of bleeds into this, where like figurative work was not really fashionable, especially figurative painting. So there was sort of like a resurgence of it in like the early 90s-ish, but it was also very much dominated by this like male gaze kind of vibe. Like you have like Jeff Koons coming out of that stuff, and Jeff Koons is a douchebag of the highest order. But like Jenny Saville is making just these beautiful pieces about like just bodies and like sort of in between spaces and like what a contemporary body really looks like, but also like this is so much about like color and paint and flesh, and it's just, I don't know, this stuff got me really excited about like art at like a pretty formative point in my life. So yeah, that's Jenny Saville.
I can see your like inspiration for sure in your work with Jenny's stuff. Like,
yeah, I mean,
it makes a lot of sense. That one on the right for me personally was the most striking, like because it's like the strokes, but it looks like a bruise, so it has that real like, I don't know, it just is like a gut punch.
Yeah,
and the one on the left here, it's honestly kind of too disturbing for me.
it's upsetting.
Yeah, it's interesting. The one on the left, it appears the one. I think you said it was her and her sister.
Yeah, she did like a hybrid portrait of her and her sister.
Okay, because I feel like one is more painterly and the other is a little bit. I just very just like I would say her work is unsettling. Is how it makes me feel when I look at it. I feel very unsettled. It's well executed, very well executed, but very unsettling at the same time.
I swear I'm hitting previous slide every single time it does that. It's driving me nuts. There we go.
This has a very Cronenberg quality, again, because everything I think about is in movies or comic books.
If you think about like Cronenberg, like I'm thinking specifically like The Fly, like you can see like there's this very like PC quality to a lot of this. So it's like it's not so much existence as it is like
no, but I maybe it's just the body horror style of I don't know, but that way of looking at a human being and then seeing something not right underneath and showing that physically represented. Yeah, I mean they're all very striking paintings.
Yeah,
especially the first one is yeah.
Wow, you look in the eyes, the tongue.
Oh, without a doubt,
a little bit.
Yeah.
I did a copy of one of her pieces for color theory class. It's not one of these.
I can see why. Yeah.
It's called Stare, and it was one of those things where I learned like a lot from it. And if you ever get the chance, I think the original is in the Broad in LA, and it won't always be on display, but like it's this crazy. She's done a bunch of versions of it, but yeah. Anyway, Jenny Saville, fucking
I would say she's always in like day one figure drawing lecture when I would teach that class. Like one of the
you're like, all right, kids.
All right, yeah, and you can imagine a bunch of Notre Dame students, right? Like, I always did manage to turn one or two students onto her a semester, so I always took that as a.
You're doing important work, Lucas.
But
I'm not joking. I sound sarcastic, but I sincerely mean that.
No, I know. I'm always doing important work. No, I think one of the ways I always kind of approach her too with students is first of all like whenever people see artists like this, right? It immediately brings into relief the sort of conventions with which we see, right? Like that's what's really great about seeing her work is there's a certain way we're used to seeing that's created by like the art historical canon, right? Especially the Western, the male gaze, etc. A certain way that images are constructed becomes a certain way in which we see the world. And so a painter like her, who basically starts to deconstruct that very deliberately, brings those things into relief for people. And so that's one of those things where it's like, it's sort of not just the abnormality, or it's not just maybe the waxiness with which she kind of recreates flesh. It's not necessarily all of these like particularly sumptuous qualities, but it's also the fact that like the way we're asked to see the figure is totally just taken apart by her, and we have to find a new way to look at the body. And I always fucking love that about her painting, about a lot of figure painters that do sort of similar things from different perspectives, where it just asks you to stop looking the way you've been taught to look, you know?
Yeah, and that's something that's like, if you look deeper into Jenny Saville's work separately from this, it's impossible not to like start having those discussions about who we're normally like looking at.
Yeah.
Like as painters, like she was the first woman in a lot of spaces, and she was the first woman in a lot of spaces in like the fucking 90s. Like that's depressing.
Pretty depressing.
So like,
yeah.
you know, it's the type of thing where like she's coming up, she started art school in 1988.
Yeah.
Like at that point, she was like in the 90s when she'd started having solo shows and stuff, she was still encountering art collectors who was like, oh, you know, like I didn't know that women could be painters. And it's like, are you fucking kidding me? Like this is 1995. Like what the fuck is wrong with you? Like,
Yeah.
but so she's like in these spaces and she's got like a completely different vantage point than what is used to being portrayed. And she's coming in with like a completely fresh perspective. And it's not that these perspectives didn't exist prior. And I think Charles White, who's the last artist that I have, and I don't know that we're going to get to him, but like he's a great example of like somebody who was in those spaces, but then just like as sort of time moved on, because he was not like the archetypal like artist that we were sort of conditioned to care about, he kind of got like written out.
Yeah.
So like, you know, she's talking a lot about how like, you know, she's in a lot of these spaces and she's sort of considered to be like, you know, one of the first women or whatever. And she's like, it's not that we didn't exist before. It's just that like we existed and then people just like put us on a shelf or like just forgot about our shit. So yeah. But like the way that you phrase that, Lucas, I think is really like clever.
Yeah. I'd say Lucas, you're really good at articulating, summarizing and articulating some of these thematics. I think that's just your molded, you know, you're a teacher, so you're an expert at this sort of thing. One of the other things I want to know, because this is my first time seeing Seville's work, one of the things I want to know too is just how powerful an impact it makes to have a large canvas, where, you know, it's one thing to see something small, but when it's at a scale like that, that painting is eating you up, it's consuming you, and it just exaggerates the impact of those. Already they're impactful.
Monumental.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said with that too. It's like, here's my statement, but let me really make it. It's going to swallow you whole, you know? I think
not fucking around.
Yeah, there's a lot of value in that too, just thinking about scale and how that, what an impact that can make in terms of having an impression on the viewer or whoever's, you know, taking in the piece. Thank you for sharing.
Like I'm going to say it, and I'm going to say it very large.
Yeah.
Yeah, we used to have a saying at CCS when I was there. Sometimes bigger is just bigger, but sometimes bigger is fucking better.
Yeah. Working less than more.
Yeah, and like, you know, paintings of that, like artwork of that size, of course, also like makes you conscious of your own body and relationship to it too, right? If you walk up to something and you have to do this and this to like see the whole thing, start thinking about your own body. Like you have to walk to see the whole thing.
You have to stand up, you have to stand back, you have to stand up, you have to stand back. Like it's a whole little dance to it.
Yep.
It's really nice.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Broad in LA has some of her work. So Jeff Darrow, oh hell yeah. He's
so I felt like this one is probably not going to be unknown to people who know comics. It's always funny. I always thought his name was Jeff Darrow, but then I found out it's Darrow. So I've been saying his name wrong for a solid, 10 years. I'm absolutely obsessed with Jeff Darrow, to the point that even my wife knows who he is. He's an absolutely incredible illustrator. He's actually a student, or was a student, of Mobius, and used to follow him around and just draw with him all the time. My stuff doesn't look like Jeff Darrow at all. I mean, I don't draw like this. I wish I could. One of the things that I always found fascinating about it, actually, go back to the last one, the first slide, is the one on the right is from Hard Boiled, which was the book he did with Frank Miller. And what's fascinating about Jeff Darrow is that he doesn't shade at all. There's no cross hatching. There's no depth perception at all. He literally just draws lines and essentially leaves it to the colorist to do everything for him. As you can tell with the piece right next to it, there's dimension, there's shadowing, there's all this. He doesn't do any of that. And what's amazing about his work is, besides him just being awesome at it, is the page is always filled with stuff to look at. And the reason why I picked that first panel with no coloring is that when you first look at it, it just looks like chaos. But if you actually sit down and look at it, there's cigarette butts, there's cans, there's cars, there's gears. And in the second one, you see, you know, the machinery, which is what he's known for. And I guess it's not like super unknown, but he was the art direction behind The Matrix. And I was unaware of that. And then when I saw The Matrix and I said, oh, I was like, man, those robots look a lot like, you know, stuff from Hard Boiled from Jeff Darrow. And then I found out that he drew them all. And for all 4 Matrix movies with the Wachowski sisters, he still continuously does all of the art for The Matrix, because he's known, because his machinery is awesome. And then on the next ones is probably what he's known for now more, which is his Shaolin Cowboy series, who's tattooed on my back because I love the Shaolin Cowboy so much. The story, he's been writing Shaolin Cowboy since the 90s now. The story is and he will even admit it, it's as thin as a sheet of paper. This one right here, Shemp's Buffet, is I think a solid 60 pages, maybe 90 pages long of him literally just fighting zombies the whole time. Like, that's it. I mean, there's no other. I mean, there's a story before as to why zombies are there, and it's wild. And then it's literally just pages upon pages of him killing zombies with a double chainsaw thing, and it's amazing. And the funny part about this, I always say, the reason why I idolize comic book art so much is this is a 2-page spread splash, right? This is not easy, you know, even though there's not like a huge amount of detail on the zombies. That's a lot of bodies, and that's a lot of, you know, sizing you have to have, and a lot of movement and control. And he's just really good at it. And the unsung hero, of course, is Dave Stewart, who's his colorist, who then has to go in and add shading and add color to the masses of lines. And speaking of big, I mean, another thing I got from Jeff Darrow is just how big he draws. Most comic will go by 11 by 17. His are absolutely massive. And he said it for the same reason that Roger Dean paints big now. He's like, what's the point of drawing small? It just makes my life harder. If I can draw bigger, then that small little can that I put in the corner now is that big, and why not? It makes it so much easier than anything else. So I wish I could draw like him. I can't, but I'm absolutely obsessed with Jeff's work. And anytime he puts something out, which is very rare, he just got done another Shaolin Cowboy series, and then you won't see anything of his probably for another 5-10 years. But it's so worth it. So I love Jeff Darrow.
Couple things to say. I noticed the same thing with him not really relying on really light or shadow much at all. And because of that, everything's kind of bare. Because it's bare, everything has to be so spot on with, like, you're talking about proportions and like there's nowhere to hide. And then I was talking earlier about Cartoonist Kayfabe, this YouTube channel. He's had multiple appearances on there. He's had a couple interviews, really down to earth, very approachable guy. So highly recommend you.
Definitely will.
Yeah, he has an interview, and then he talks about the influence on his work from Akira. So I thought I was watching it this morning to kind of prep for this a little bit, but I just was really enamored with the guy himself.
What am I? Sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry. Oh, I was just going to say one of my favorites is this is just a book of all his penciling.
Oh, hell yeah.
I reference this all the time. He's a big fan of just drawing random items so that he can add them. And again, you just get wild machines and people doing crazy shit. And even the cover is absolutely amazing. I mean, what the hell is that?
When did you buy that? Is it still for sale, you think?
It should be. It's on Dark Horse.
Okay.
Yeah, it's called it's just the Pencils of Director. Oh, Lead Poisoning. That's what it's called.
But yeah, no, his work, like his line work and like the sort of the character of all of that really reminds me also of Frank Quitely.
Oh, without doubt, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they're both, they don't, It's less is more with the lines.
But they're also like they are packing in a lot of detail with it. They're just like not like they're also I think they place a lot of trust in the colorist.
Yeah,
which I think is really fun.
I'm going to fire some shots here and say I don't think the colorist is really carrying that much of the artwork. I think the color work is good, but I would say like he's kind of showing how much you can do with just contour line. Like that's what this is. It's all.
Yeah.
I mean, the work is still dimensional. He's just doing it all with contour line rather than with value, and it lends it a really interesting look that is really, really appealing to the eye for sure.
I will say that I do agree with the way that you put that, but I think also because he's leaving it as mostly contour line, he's also like allowing for kind of a lot of room for whoever the colorist is to play.
Yeah, I'm just saying there's not like a lot. Like if you look at like the piece on the right here, it's colored, but if you look at the value work, there's not a lot of high contrast value work in that color. Like that green on those tiles, it's only a little bit darker than the green that's supposed to be catching the light. So it's like it's not that the color work is doing the dimensionalness. You know what I mean? It's all in his.
But I would also say that it's partially like he doesn't. The person who's doing the color doesn't have to do much.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Because of what you're saying. Yeah. So like my guess is like if you are somebody who has to color a Jeff Darrow comic, like you show up and you're like, you know what, I get to actually kind of like do some fun stuff with this and like not have like you don't have to like carry more of it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Well, he only uses one person now, which is Dave Stewart. And Dave Stewart.
Okay.
Yeah, and Dave Stewart has said he knows when he gets pages from Jeff. He's I already know what I'm going to be doing. He does say it does take a lot of time because there's, again, even if you zoom in on that picture on the left, I mean, it's literally the most random odd shit just lying around that, you know, it's a pain in the butt when you're doing it digitally. After a while, it probably gets really annoying.
It sounds like a nightmare. It's like
I wouldn't want to do it. Yeah,
every like little component, does get like done with a different color to that next to it, so everything does kind of pop that way.
Yeah,
but I think it's kind of interesting that the colorist still does like leave a lot of that sense of space and dimension up to just the contour line, and it is like kind of gorgeous to look at stuff that's sometimes just described that way. Like,
that might be part of why it's reminding me of Frank Quitely, is because I think some of the Frank Quitely comics that I've seen, there is like a very similar relationship between like the contour line and the color work.
I would agree. Yeah, he's got a similar style.
Yeah. It's insane.
Sweet, Mark.
Okay. All right. So the next artist I'm going to talk about is Alfonso Ruiz. He went by the moniker of Alfonso Arcor Ruiz. He oh gosh. Okay. So I'll try to give a brief background. Maybe I don't know. You guys familiar with underground death metal, for example? A lot of this stuff was achieved through snail mail back in the day. So when I got started in the scene in 91, one of the bands my brother and I wrote to was Pipe from Gurkum, which was a Mexican death metal band, and Alfonso was the singer for that band, and he did all their artwork for the band. They're like a sort of like a anti-satanic death metal band is kind of how they coined themselves, which is peculiar, but whatever the case. I remember Alfonso sending us, some photocopies of his drawings. I've got one framed here on my studio wall because I love his work so much. But he, let's see if we grab a couple things. Let's see. So he's done stuff for a lot of bands, but he kind of fell out of the scene in the late 90s, and so he doesn't really do this anymore. I think he's completely removed from the metal scene at this point, but. I think he got into like bodybuilding for a while or something. Anyway, he doesn't do this kind of stuff anymore. But this is like a classic Cenotaph, 7-inch EP from Baphomet Records. It has his artwork on the cover as well as one of the examples. I just scanned it in for the presentation, but it's got his illustration of of the band. Sorry, I'm not very good at this. This is recently repressed by David at Extremely Rotten Productions from Denmark. So that picture that Alfonso drew is on the cover of the cassette repress that just came out. But it got a couple other things. Another sort of a rare item is the Cenotaph. I think it's a live CD. It's packaged in a DVD case that Alfonso did the artwork for. Got an old 7-inch he did a painting for. It's an Italian band called Agonia. Pretty cool stuff. And I grabbed an old Costa Rican fanzine where I pulled some of that. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. The Relia. It's I guess a Cthulhu kind of thing. The logo he drew for that band, they're a Mexican band. He also did a lot of stuff for some fanzines. Like this is an old Mexican fanzine called Capaticism Zine. I think he drew the logo for that one. But this is a relic, man. There's like a lot of old bands in here. There's a bunch of Mexican bands. So you got the pipe and garden flyer in there, which I think I scanned in also. But this is just to kind of give you a sense of like some of the stuff I was exposed to. And here's an old the band Cataclysm, little flyer. Just some really old stuff in here. See if I can find the other relics really quick. But that's kind of what I was exposed to in my youth. Getting into. Here's an old one for you guys. It's an old At the Gates.
There it is.
Our Lord, some old stuff. Old releases. Anyhow, I was always appreciative of Alfonso's artwork. Huge fan of his style. Of course, very highly detailed and a lot of sort of merging of creatures and forms, which I think you can see reflected a lot in the art that I do with my pen and ink work. The Grotesque Infection stuff is a New York band. That stuff just recently got repressed by CDN Records and Extremely Rotten Productions also. So that artwork has resurfaced again recently in the form of like CD cassette shirts and stuff. But I always was really fond of his style and approach. The level of detail he placed into his work really spoke to me. And I kind of took that and try to sort of emulate it in some ways. And even when you look at like a lot of the bands now that are kind of re-illustrating their logos, like you can see this stuff was all done like in the early '90s too. It's not like a new phenomenon or anything like that. But yeah, definitely a band my brother and I we were in touch with for a short brief while in the early '90s, and his artwork left a pretty strong impression on me. And again, like an artist, I don't think gets talked about a lot in the metal scene because he had kind of a brief career. He did stuff for like some other bands like Lividity, and I think he may have done something for Regurgitation at one point. So not super well known bands, but enough to kind of where you're seeing some of his older work being repressed. Like Cenotaph is like a huge. You look at bands like Cerebral Rot and stuff like that, major like Cenotaph worship. So there's a lot of modern bands that look to Cenotaph as an inspiration, and Alfonso is responsible for a lot of the artwork associated with Cenotaph earlier in their career. Anyhow, that's my next pick. Nothing super deep or nothing that has.
It's so influential though. Like I see so many people ripping this off. Like
in terms of the way it looks, yeah. It was to my own art for sure.
Okay, no. Like, let's be fair. You're not ripping this off. You are influenced by, but that's not.
For sure, yeah. But that was in my youth. I couldn't draw like that when I was 15. So I had something to look at to kind of. I've always kept so. Just to give you an idea of the impact his work had on me, I always carry like an art folder around with me. It's like a regular folder with instead of work 8.5 by 11. I always carry it around with me so I can pull out, a drawing, at my leisure if I'm sitting in the doctor's office or whatever, and start doodling for a few minutes or whatever. So I carried it around with me, but I had like one of Alfonso's photocopies sitting in that folder so I could have it as quick like inspiration. You know what I mean? That's the kind of impact that his work had on me. Not a well-known artist, but for me, always like a pivotal illustrator.
Yeah, he might not be well known, but like it's so clear the influence that a lot of this stuff had.
Yeah,
it's got a lot of like it's got a lot of reach. And the thing I really like about a lot of the kind of older like very underground death metal artwork that was done like this, especially this artist, like the way it lends itself to being photocopied a billion times too. Like it actually just like, seems to get better the more it degrades from being photocopied. Like it looks more and more gross, and like I fucking love that like aesthetic. Like it's really it's really like it's another thing where it just like it steeps me back in like high school when I was first getting into death metal. You know what I mean? Like shit that I would also just like draw in my fucking on the back of my homework or whatever.
And to your point, like there is such like a DIY kind of feel to this where like what we're looking at clearly has been Xeroxed like 9 times.
Yeah.
And it still like maintains this really awesome like atmosphere and line quality.
Yeah, here's another zine, for example, where you can see some of Alfonso's frame illustrations. And of course it's probably like
fucking sick.
It's probably like third or fourth generation photocopy at this point, by the time I'm looking at it here in this fanzine. But that's the kind of stuff that I'm talking about, like this, you see me doing a lot of stuff like this, but that's because I looked at these fanzines when I was
but like
13, 14, 15 years old, so it left an impression on me. So I'm just trying to preserve that look and feel in my own work. And you can see Alfonso is clearly one of those artists who sat with me, his style sat with me for a long time.
Well, and one of the things that's always really fun about this too is like you can see the influence, but also like you draw the way that you draw. So like the influence is there, but it's still very much like in your hand and in your voice.
Oh yeah, sure.
And like I think that's been true for pretty much everybody that everyone has shown is like there is a clear influence.
Yeah.
Like content wise and style wise, but like we all draw the way that we draw or paint the way that we paint, and like that the hand does kind of come through in it.
Right.
We are each of us a different kind of meat grinder that we've run all of our influences through,
Yeah, and I'm a meat grinder who can't really draw like anybody else. So.
Exactly.
Lucas, you said something really cool, and you said a lot of things that are really cool. But when you talked about that idea of it lends itself for Xeroxing, and as Caroline said, that DIY quality. I mean, that's kind of how it was back in the day. That I remember, especially in when I started getting into the underground scene. We're talking like 95, 96.
Yeah.
I mean, there wasn't the internet. We didn't have access to scanning stuff. So I remember doing shitty ass flyers for local bands, and it was like, I got to draw like a weird, skulls and tits or whatever. It was like you had to do it. And you
regret phrasing it that way.
But it's apt. I love it. I might put that in my Instagram byline. Skulls and tits. But it's seriously like this style, and not to blow smoke up your ass, Mark, but you are like one of the few that still kind of keep this style alive as well as it should be. There's a lot of people that try to imitate it, and I could see someone looking at it and saying, that looks shitty or whatever. It's actually, it takes a lot of time and a lot of work. And in fact, in the second slide, there is, as Caroline kind of inferred, like there is a resurgence of that style now. And I'm not really a fan of it. I'm a fan of this. I'm just not a fan of some of the people that are putting it out now because it's a very watered down version. Not that they don't work hard for it, but it
gets back to some of the stuff we were talking about earlier where it's like, all right, like maybe just make the art that looks like your art, and like you don't need to do the thing that somebody else has already been done or somebody else has already done because like somebody else already did it. Like you don't need to. But like this is like the prime example of like someone did it and kicked ass at it.
Yeah. Exactly,
Yeah,
and
this has a spontaneity to it where it's like this is what came out of this guy's pen when he sat down to draw. Like this is what he, where his brain was at when he was listening to like whatever tapes that he traded for or whatever. You know what I mean? Like like there's like definitely like a spontaneity to it. Whereas this stuff that we're talking about now, it's very studied. That sort of ends being the problem. Is it's like it's so deliberately affected and kind of modeled after this look that it doesn't end up being able to capture that same mood quite as well.
Yeah, this is there's a time and a place for this, and it's in the past. And I feel like, I still feel like even though it's just like all the art we've been looking at, it's older, but it still resonates. It resonates with us. And this is again something that just sort of hit me in my youth when I was just trying to get my start. And this is like kind of what I wanted to work toward. Doing something like this, and Alfonso just doesn't get the same kind of accolades I think a lot of other underground like metal artists from that era did, get now. So wanted to make sure that his work,
that's a great pick.
And it's pronounced Raleigh.
Thank you. Thank you.
How that translates to it, I don't know. But it's the city where
literally my entire life.
It's pronounced Raleigh. It's
North Carolina.
Like North Carolina. That's where Cthulhu's city is. Apparently, it's in North Carolina.
Barbecue and
I don't know. I've been to North Carolina. I could see Cthulhu hanging out there.
It's a lot of spooky shit.
Yeah.
In various places. Anyway.
All right, last picks.
Yes. Wangahichi. Yeah. Fuck yeah. I'm so excited about this one.
So so for my last artist, when I talk about Wangechi Mutu, she's another artist, Kenyan-born artist, but she's been living and working in New York City for like the last 25 years, I think. Born in 1971, so she's in her 50s now, 51 or something like that. 1972, so she's 51. Caroline just told me she just had a huge retrospective at the new museum, which I totally fucking missed.
I fucked up and didn't go to it either.
Yeah, I slapped myself for not going to this. So she's another artist that I was, came onto while I was in art school. So, I had a long period where, I started in art when I started college and then kind of quickly got kind of talked out of it and moved to biology. And then for like 10 years, I just fucked around and drew whatever I wanted to, but didn't really think too much about the art world. So when I came back to art school and saw work like this, my mind was blown because like the teachers I had in like when I was 18 and 19, we're talking 1999, 2000. I had teachers who still acted like it was like the 80s. So they were like, "Oh, the shit, you can't do the shit you're doing. That's called weirdo art. That's not a thing. You can't make a living doing that. It's got to be heroic, masculine, abstract steel sculpture or nothing else." It was basically what I was told. So I was really like, I kind of turned off of studio art basically for like 10 years because I didn't know you could do this.
Richard Serra, nothing.
Yeah. So I when I was exposed to stuff like this, it was definitely mind blowing. And her work, I mean, she's very much a multimedia artist. Most of the work that really influenced me would be her kind of 2D work on paper. Once again, it's still multimedia. She's using paint, watercolor, ink, collage, and it's kind of the collage aspects of this that were really influential on me. I spent like most of when I was at CCS, so like the 3 years I was at CCS, I spent most of my time doing collage and not really doing very much else. Like I fucking loved collage, mostly because of her work. So, the sort of I don't know, the sort of nut of her work, I guess, is she's sort of dealing with I guess issues of feminism, sort of related to, partly, I guess, specifically to her, experiences in Kenya, but also that there's a lot of elements that can be kind of universalized a little bit. But her, she's basically making these kind of weird hybrid women, these figures that are hybrid women that are the collage elements are constructed out of like fashion magazines and medical texts and porn magazines and all kinds of other sources, National Geographic, things like she's combining kind of animal parts in there, floral part, botany as well. and she's just creating these like interesting kind of hybrids that kind of toe the line between being like monstrous and also being I don't know, I guess referential to kind of more, I suppose you'd say, like natural themes or almost maybe environmental themes. But what's really interesting to me about her work was this notion of monstrosity, and monstrosity as being something that's sort of related to hybridity, and it's one of those things that's where it's like it's kind of walking the line between being one thing or being another, between being something that's reviled and something that's cheered for. It's like one of those things like we're all attracted to monsters at the same time that people we're all sort of repelled by them as well. And so that tension that exists in her work, I find really, really interesting. It's obviously very interesting when it's applied to questions of the female body, and it's applied to questions of the place of women in specifically different kind of cultural traditions. But it's also interesting when it's sort of applied more universally too, when we think about that kind of hybridity. I think one of the reasons that her work really spoke to me a lot was because my whole kind of life has been an experience of being a hybrid. I grew up in a multiracial household. My grandmother's from Japan, so there was always this like improvised mishmash of like Japanese culture and like working class white American culture that I grew up with. So I've like that kind of hybridity is always like the kid who did well in school, but then was into like death metal and punk music. So was I friends with the nerds? Was I friends with the burnouts? Same thing in school. Like I was the art student who had a science background, and it was, like that was always a weird kind of line for me to walk at first. So I think that her work really spoke to me partly because of that whole conversation around the hybrid and the monster. And the way that she was kind of constructing that visually, the way she was visually embodying that through like a multimedia practice that involved collage really, really spoke to me, like kind of pushed me to do a lot of collage work in response to it. And I kind of think to this day that time spent, like almost 3 whole years spent like almost exclusively doing collage, except for, doing some drawing and painting, has actually influenced the way I think about constructing images, even when I'm just making a drawing. Like I try to think about hybridity in the same way. I try to think about jamming things together that maybe don't necessarily make sense to be part of the same organism. It's also like an idea that Mark was talking about with Ruiz's work too, where it's like these things that sort of melt into each other. We see this a little bit in some of Mutu's work too, where it becomes hard to separate the figure from the ground. They start to tangle one, together. And that was something that I also really responded to, this notion of like unstable boundaries between bodies and their environments as well. And so like, for me, that comes out like in death metal art, like images of decaying corpses is like totally my version of what she's doing with figures that melt into their ground or figures that are seemingly attached to each other. It's just like the decaying corpse becomes another way of talking about a similar thing, a body without boundaries, right? So her work really still, like, I think it finds its way into even the stuff I do now, even when I'm just asked to draw like draw us a sick, zombie guy. I'm like, all right, well, he's going to definitely be melting and have lots of strands going into like another body, because that's like the Mutu influence on me of like this sort of body with questionable boundaries. It's always going to end up being in there.
One of the things I want to point out too, I mean, there's sort of this. I like your point, Lucas, about the bleeding of the body into the grounding or whatever's trying to ground the Mutu's work. But not just that, but it almost feels seamless when I look at it in terms of I can't tell if I'm looking at a collaged element or paint. Right. It all looks uniform, and I have to say, compositionally, like all the pieces, save for the sculptures are they're easy to interpret.
Yeah,
to
they're in the round. They're in the round, so they're a little differently. Yeah,
man, the compositions and these mixed media pieces are just very unusual, almost testing my my sense of, is there balance here? Is there an appropriate use of asymmetry on here? I can't tell. I feel challenged by that. in some regard. I actually kind of like having that, kind of like with some of the work Caroline was showing, with that sort of sense of I'm uncomfortable with this.
Yeah.
I feel unsettled by this, and I like that. It almost speaks to kind of the work that we do work in the metal scene. There's something gross and unruly about it that it's not the same. It's not the same kind of work by any means, but it leaves you with a similar feeling, and so I can appreciate that. I almost feel like this middle piece. I feel like I'm almost looking at it like a Septage or a Carcass album cover or something. Even though it's not quite as blatant, but it leaves me with that same sense of that gross feeling.
It definitely like converges almost on a similar visual language, right? To that kind of like collage art that typifies a lot of like gore grind, things like that. It without starting from the similar place. What I also like about it, maybe to your point, Mark, about like this how these work compositionally. I mean, they also almost feel to me like they were built organically without a lot of planning. Like she just started in a place and then just let it go. And that's like a whole nother way of working that is also something that is like amazes me when artists pursue that kind of method, one where you make a move and respond to it, you don't have a plan. And you end up with these compositions that you could never have planned a composition like that. It's only going to happen if you just do it,
Right. Stream of consciousness. This kind of reminds me, Lee, with some of the older work that you were sharing with me a month ago. You kind of took a more kind of you kind of moved to wherever your intuition told you to on the paper. That's kind of the feeling. You're right. Maybe it is, and I'd be kind of curious about Mutu's work if that is indeed how she functions as an artist. How planned is her work? Like, is her approach to each piece? Maybe it is very much stream of consciousness, but either way, the compositions are unsettling and unusual. And I have to say, I can't tell where the collage begins or ends, or where the paint begins or ends. It all looks very uniform in a way.
Which I think that also just sort of speaks to the strength of her skill with materials too. Mm-hmm. Like there's actually like a very like materials focused way of getting into this work as well, because she's so clearly like she's like relishing like the actual things that she's working with in a way that I think is really fun.
Nothing's hidden. Like she's not hiding anything about how she's making these, right?
Right.
Like a splat of paint is a splat of paint, even if it's also something else. A collage piece is a collage piece, and it sits on the surface, even though it like coheres with the other things. It's still like none of it's like kind of hidden, which is really kind of fantastic. I just love like the piece on the right. One of the things I really love that like found it's like I kind of just blatantly stole it was like those little like almost like pubes that are sort of like the bottom like left, those pubic hair kind of hairs. Oh man, I was putting that on little monsters I was drawing for fucking years because of her. I just loved those little hairs that she put on stuff.
They're like little cilia.
Yeah, they're cilia, but they're also like they are also like a pube.
But they're more like
they're like kind of there's something about them that's like it's everything that's indecent, right? That's like it's literally deliberately kind of recalling itself to things that we tend to think of as indecent about the body, right?
Well, she caused a real kerfuffle with some national arts funding.
Yeah.
That folks can Google later. I don't want to derail, but yeah, some of her other work caused like a real kerfuffle with some arts funding. She was like a real poster child for someone who like did not pay attention to the art or the message of the art to just like point to and be like, we don't need to spend money on this. And it's like, all right, we're spending like no money on this. Calm your tits. Like, but yeah, she's an incredible artist. This is a really fun.
One of the things I want to point out too on the other slide that I find interesting is, and again, it's probably not controlled or super intentional, just judging by the way her work looks. But I like the air that she's let breathe through the piece on the right, where there's sort of these open areas these gaps where it's just the background, the white kind of shows through. I think that's a nice way to break up the piece without it feeling too overwhelming. And I don't think when a layperson looks at a piece of art, they're not always understanding why they like it, but sometimes it's a negative space that really helps make a piece really visually interesting. And I think the one on the right really makes very good use of the negative space, especially given how
breathe.
yeah.
Charles White.
All right. So my short spiel for this is that Charles White is somebody that I did not learn about until he had a major retrospective at 3 museums. And that's kind of insane to me. And actually the 2 pictures that are in this, like the 2 ones on the left are both pictures that I took at the exhibitions. He's like an incredible draftsperson, incredible painter. He was born in Chicago in 1918, I want to say. Got scholarships to multiple art schools, got those scholarships revoked when people found out that he was Black. He is an incredibly influential figurative artist. He taught also, so like Kerry James Marshall was one of his students. David Hammons was one of his students. The person on the left in that piece is Harry Belafonte. And just like the fucking life that he manages to get into these people, like in his pictures, is just incredible. The detail, the line work, the form, all of the way that he builds all of this stuff is just like beautiful. And it is a fucking crime that he did not come up in a lot of my classes. Because he's also sort of like a really prime example of like, obviously like race played a very like significant factor in the fact that he was just effectively kind of like left out of a lot of textbooks and stuff like that. But also on top of that, there's like a lot of figurative art is also not really considered kind of all that important in an art historical context for the period in which he was working. So it kind of got scrubbed out of books. So like his line work is incredible. Like I managed to see this exhibit twice on both coasts because it happened to be in LA when I was in LA. He also was he was briefly also married to Elizabeth Catlett, who's a really influential printmaker and sculptor and draftsperson. So he and she both studied at a similar place in Mexico for a bit, which is really more evident in a lot of his like linoleum cuts. But yeah, he just like he portrays like life and bodies and struggles and joys and strength, and just like it like suffuses all of his line work in addition to just the subject, which I think is really incredible. And like the examples that I have here are like emblematic of a specific style and a period of his life. The 2 main drawings are like the folk singer one with Harry Belafonte and then the one with 2 women in it. Those are from the 50s. And the one of like the sort of heavier set woman in profile is actually an etching, and that's like from the 1970s. But they're both just like, they're all just incredible. And his just, I was so like taken aback by just like the caliber of his work and the emotion present in all of it. And like he did a lot of paintings and drawings and stuff of like actual like musicians and stuff like that, and he manages to like get the feel of like the music and the environment and like that kind of stuff in the stuff that he's doing of like musicians. So like the Harry Belafonte one, like you can see and like feel and like hear that drawing.
Going back to the use of negative space, when you look at these 2 pieces in particular, excellent use of negative space. Look, there's no information really happening in that negative space, but the space that he has created is making an impact. Like above Belafonte's head, you have quite a lot of negative space that's just empty and unused. Same with the woman staring off. She wouldn't look like she's staring off into the abyss, if you will, if there wasn't that added sense of space there. And I think it's great use of negative space.
And Lee, if you go to the next one.
On
this one especially also, like he uses the space around the figures in a really beautiful way.
So I could see the one being the etching for sure. That's what I was going to ask if these were like prints that you
These
were
are
looking
drawings.
at. So these are
the woman in profile is an
Mhm.
etching.
Okay.
Belafonte is a drawing, and the other two women are drawing, and they're like a mix of ink, colored ink, and pencil, actually. And the one that's underneath the picture of the artist himself is from his Wanted series posters.
Okay.
That one, I'm not sure what the medium is, but that series of posters was like, most of the time he was drawing people that were like fairly fully clothed. But if he was ever drawing the nude, it was often in the context of this like Wanted series. It was a commentary on like wanted posters for escaped slaves.
Okay.
So like he would draw like a sort of riff on like escaped enslaved people, and then like the posters that were kind of drawn up where it really commodified the body. And so in most of his other pieces, he's actually drawing like more like clothed figures.
Okay.
But when he deliberately chooses to do something where the figure is nude or unclothed or something like that, it's usually as part of a commentary on like the commodification of the body.
Okay.
Anyway, he kicks ass.
Yeah,
and
I love
if you
it.
ever get a chance to see his stuff in person, it's just like phenomenal.
Well,
and this like barely scratches the surface.
He has a lot of variety. As I was digging deeper, some more like cubist kind of related stuff in his own style.
Yeah, well, he started out as like doing like some WPA kind of stuff in like the 30s. He was very heavily influenced early on by a lot of like the Mexican muralists. So like Diego Rivera, that kind of scene. Yeah, but then his got more.
Do you know what's wild and especially his figure work? For me, reminds me a lot, very similar. I wonder if he was influenced by Charles White, of Crumb and a lot of the Zap artists.
So they would definitely have been aware of Charles White because in his lifetime, Charles White was like incredibly famous. It's just like he died in the late 70s, I want to say. He contracted tuberculosis while he was enlisted, and it like ended up later in life infecting his other lung, and so he died. I think it was either late 70s or early 80s.
Yeah, consumption's a horrible way to go.
Yeah,
it's sad, man. But just the contours of the face, it just reminds me of Crumb. I know it sounds weird, you know what I mean? But like when I'm looking at these, you know, and just very fascinating.
Larger hands and the larger forearms too.
Yeah, the large hands thing is like a hallmark of a lot of his work because he was also often talking about sort of like physical strength as a part of sort of like, you know, kind of resilience and like endurance in the face of all this other like bullshit and just, you know. But so a lot of his a lot of his figures have sort of like slightly larger hands or like usually very strong and muscular. This one specifically is also I think it's called "Oh Mary, Don't You Weep" or something like that, and it's titled such because it's after a sort of a gospel tune that was initially written by enslaved people as kind of like a song of like coded liberation and resistance. But he actually wrote this prior to that song then kind of getting taken up by, or sorry, he drew this prior to that song getting taken up by the civil rights movement as sort of like a major song of the civil rights movement. So like this, I think came out in like, he finished this in 1957, and like the very famous version of it that popularized it within the civil rights movement was done, I want to say 1959. It had, of course, like been recorded a bunch of times prior to that, but like the version that kind of like thrust it into like the rest of like the zeitgeist at the time was recorded in 1957 or 1959. Yeah. So, but yeah, like there's also like a cool thing with like music suffuses a lot of his work, which is really fun. So I thought he was like a fun pick on that level too, because like, you know, art that responds to music, I think, is also just like kind of a common thread. But yeah, Charles White.
Hey, back to skulls and titties.
With one of the best to ever do it.
That's a fact. So I'll be quick with Braum. I mean, most people know who Braum is. The reason why I picked him, though, isn't that he's amazing. Was again from a time perspective when he really became big. I mean, he started out in the TSR stable and painted kind of very basic fantasy stuff until the Dark Sun campaign came out for D&D, and he had these Mad Max like things just so different. And just like Frazetta revolutionized things, Braum really revolutionized fantasy painting for me in the 90s. He made it weird. He introduced that early 90s goth vibe to fantasy art. A lot of his early paintings of women were, Samantha Mathau-esque, for the old heads, very pale skin, that kind of thing. And not a lot of movement in his paintings. I feel like the majority of his paintings feel like still lifes. Just always were. And I mean, the one with Conan, my dad immigrated from Greece, so he was obsessed with Conan and John Wayne. So I've always had an affinity towards Conan, but just the multitude of colors he would use, particularly the succubus on the left, which is a relatively newer painting, his contrasting of the blues for metal. It'll always feel like metal, not the music, the actual physical thing is always just painted gray. That's the ornament. Well, it's got to be gray, but it can have all colors, and it can be green, it can be blue, and he was just so good, and his backgrounds were so amazing. He would have all these detailed but faint backgrounds to really create a world in his painting. So that's why I always found him very influential, and he's still one of my favorite artists. And of course, these are all the colors I paint in now, because this painting I was obsessed with when I was like 12 years old. 10, 12 years old for Dark Sun. Again, he just made fantasy art weird at a time where everything was still Lord of the Rings. Everybody had a beard. There was always halflings. Everyone was wearing cloaks. And he said, no, they're all, the men are going to be androgynous. They're going to be pale. They're going to wear corsets. And it's just going to be different. So I always loved Braum. Still look at his stuff. He's still active, I think. Doesn't paint that much, but yeah.
Yeah, I always remember appreciating his work too. When I was growing up, kind of never hardcore into it, but definitely was very aware, and I always liked his stuff, his style more than Frazetta, for example. Just something. And you're right, there is sort of a stoicism, like a about his work, and that there's not a lot of movement. It's very much like you described, a still life, like a snapshot in time, with not a lot of action. I guess it's more like somebody posing. That piece has more action in it, just because of the angle, that diagonal composition. But
it's more like portraiture.
Yeah, without a doubt.
He manages to pack a lot of different hues into it too. Really
and that was from a color standpoint, he was just always very good with color. I would say it like he's dead. He's not. He's still very good with color. And it's just I always, the way that he does skin tones in various colors.
Well, and the way that he gets really cool volume. I mean, obviously he's painting a lot of super unrealistically muscly people, but he's also really leaning into that as far as creating actual kind of shape and volume and kind of different surfaces and planes kind of moving around. It's really nice.
100%. So that's Braum. He's my dude.
I dig it.
All
right, so for me, I picked Yoshitaka Amano. So a little about him, Japanese artist and illustrator. He started professional work at the age of 15, and he was basically doing a job doing animation and stuff. And he eventually then became freelance several years after that. And then a lot of people know his work from Final Fantasy and then also Vampire Hunter. which I haven't personally read, but I have a couple of the pieces here. But you know, I remember seeing this stuff a lot as a kid, but I wasn't like intentionally like, oh, I'm a huge Yoshitaka Amano fan. I just really like the art of Final Fantasy, and you know, since then I've gotten a couple books. Here's like one I have, and I just love how spontaneous some of his pieces are, and then also how he balances really intricate pockets of detail with then large, you know, areas of just flat color or just really good design related choices. So I actually see a lot of similarities personally between Jue and Amano in that aspect of intricate detail, um, mixed with a lot of area where your eyes can rest in negative space. So, and then the other thing is he's really good with the brush as well as pens. So he's very good with different, you know, media. A lot of his pieces are mixed media between acrylic, watercolor. So things that I love to do, for me, you know, gouache and watercolor, and then pen and ink. So I guess for me, from a technical perspective, I find it really inspirational as well, how flowy everything can be, yet still have a lot of really cool detail.
Does he usually? Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to comment on the color palette. It's very much yellow, like warm brown tones. And is that typical, or okay.
Yeah, I just put them together to make it look easy on the eye. But he has a lot of really vibrant stuff as well. He has different periods. He does some. I'll do solo layout in a second. But I
Is that Batman?
Yeah.
Batman.
I was going to say, while we were taking the brief break before we launched into this, I was talking about I had this book when I was a teenager called Vertigo Visions. That was a bunch of the Vertigo covers, and he did one of the post Sandman covers that was like really evocative and stuck in my head. But like he really manages to mix up a bunch of different mark making styles, kind of all in one, and it feels very cohesive and beautiful and sort of dreamlike, which I really enjoy.
Is it gouache or watercolor or
watercolor, acrylic, and then he does do some pen stuff. And here's like an example of some pen and ink like drawings for Final Fantasy.
Nice.
Final Fantasy 1 actually for this one.
I remember those.
But I just love how I think he's just super quick, and as somebody who is really into like doing a lot of sketching in sketchbook, I just I like seeing people do really fast stuff in between big, you know, complex pieces. I think there's something to that.
Yeah, I like the sort of the washiness of some of the part. Like, it's definitely anchored by some of the ink work, but there's definitely a washiness and a sort of like a looseness to some of his work. Some of it gets. Sorry.
So they manage to be very gestural, you know, like the way that they're talking, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, he manages to make the water-based media kind of work for him. Like he understands that if, like, when you get sort of that washy tone, you can kind of get it to do a whole bunch of different things as far as like depth and texture, and this dude's a master. So.
And I think to your point, Lee, like you were saying, Philippe Droulet, you know, it's not about the anatomy being one, like no one's going to say that horse is, you know, it's exactly like a horse, but it's the vibe that you get from it. You know, he's telling a story here. He's creating a world in which you're seeing these paintings, and it's less about, is this anatomically correct? Is this accurate? And it's more about, yes, but this is how I want it to look, and this is the feel that I want the piece to have. And it's very brave to do that, and I think it's really cool.
Yeah, I think that's something I've touched on in the past too, with speaking with people. It just has to be enough information to convince. You know, doesn't have to be always accurate. But like, look at this creature on the right, for example. It's essentially a horse, but look at the talons on that thing. That's like a really unique choice. You know, it's just that little modification brings it more into a fantasy realm. It's really interesting. I don't think I'm familiar with this artist. This is my first time seeing
There's so much work. He's extremely prolific.
Maybe I've seen it in passing. Like some of these artists I've seen in passing, but just didn't know their names.
So much of it is Final Fantasy art. What I meant by prolific was just sketch after sketch after sketch. Which I think is so cool.
Nice.
Sweet.
Yeah, what I've always liked about Amano's work is that he's really good at kind of leaving areas of visual rest where there's very little kind of going on, and then he will have like detail areas kind of condensed together. And you see that through a lot of his work, and I always find that really. I think I came across his work probably when I was a teenager at some point, and I remember trying to adopt that style for a little bit, not being very successful. But I always really appreciate that. He's really good at making these kind of decisions about where to focus his the information that's in the image, in terms of like mark making, and where to leave kind of areas of rest, and how to kind of maintain a gestural quality to how he's like kind of laying in the figures so they maintain a certain dynamism. It's just a lot to appreciate about it.
Awesome. Bring us home, Mark.
Last one. Okay, so pretty straightforward. Some of you, if you're in the metal, you know who Chris Moyen is.
Mm-hmm.
We kind of got our start around the same time. He predates me a little bit. 89, I think, is when Chris got his start. He's a French artist. He essentially started publishing his work through the Sarcophago and Blasphemy fan clubs, European fan clubs. And so getting his art published in those realms, soon after bands and labels were starting to reach out to him. And he did a lot of the, I think I read that the first two releases he formally inked included some Seraphic Decay vinyls for Durketa and Mortician, were his first published pieces. The Beharit one is probably the one that got him the most visibility, and sort of like pretty much the standard of what Chris defines his work, essentially. So the Beharit cover. Also important to note that he drew the Beharit logo, which is cool. He's done a good handful of logos as well, including like Amorphous, their first logo. The Pertinence album cover is probably one of my favorites, and it's sort of an example of like a colored piece, which is not super typical of his work. He usually does black and white. I prefer his work in black and white personally, but wanted to show at least one color piece. But some of the other stuff on here, like the Incantation, that was the first 7-inch EP I ever bought, was that Incantation record. So that one always kind of, had an impact on me. But also some of these things, like, I'll grab some where I got this hands from. Hopefully I can find some of these. But like the Demon Sea, that was from an old fanzine called Mutilated Carcass. I don't know if I have this right. God, I'm so disoriented. Okay, so like that's that's his logo and his illustration on that bio for Demon Sea, which is like post per Fanatica. But again, like just seeing his work and some of these old, again, the Demon Sea logo and a couple of his drawings popping up at the top of this interview. This is kind of how I experienced Chris's artwork. He's an old Incantation interview with his artwork. That's kind of my first exposure to his stuff, was seeing it in underground fanzines and on some record covers and a couple, cassettes and whatnot. But he's still widely published. He still is doing a lot of work to this day. I've had the opportunity to collaborate with him on a few occasions, which is really cool. But Chris, I always kind of considered him like my European counterpart. We were both very active at the same time. But a lot of the stuff I was doing was like being in touch with American bands and mostly doing death metal stuff, whereas he was in touch with like a lot of the European bands and doing black metal mostly. So I always had a major appreciation for Chris and his work. You can't have be in the scene without seeing something he's done or owning something that he's worked on. He's like he's a legend essentially. I feel like in the metal scene, and he's always been an artist whose work I've appreciated and looked toward for inspiration. He does have a new book coming out soon from Cult Never Dies, which is a British publisher, I believe. I think that should be out soon. I was in touch with Chris actually a couple weeks ago, very briefly, and he mentioned that he had a book coming out soon. So be on the lookout for that. But yeah. So again, pretty straightforward stuff. Nothing too deep. A lot of skulls, demons, and shit like that. That's what Chris is all about. Always loved his ink work. Very, very unique, very distinct, recognizable style, and I feel like that's a good hallmark for any artist to achieve.
Yeah, and like with the last guy, whose name I'm blanking on because my brain is now liquid. But there's like a lot of that stuff that Lucas kind of picked up on where you can see how this would work as something that's been Xeroxed 9,000 times.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it still manages to retain like that original character, which is very cool.
Yeah, and like some of these scans are straight up from like third generation photocopies from fanzines. Like that Balance of Terror magazine ad. Like that's actually like a hair drawing now. This is something you see in the underground scene all the time, where drawings would be cut, lifted from something, cut and pasted into a page layout. Like that's an example of one of Chris's drawings for Beharit being used for a magazine flyer from like '92. There's a character about that, and I feel like Chris has maintained that sort of quality in his work, preserving that old school style, and it still resonates with fans today. They're still hiring him, and always loved his work.
Yeah, he's got iconic pieces. I mean, the Incantation cover is iconic. The Beharit cover is iconic. That's enough said. I mean, like I said, like you were saying, if you've been in the underground for any period of time, and if you're old as fuck like me, I mean, yeah, I remember seeing that shit. You know what I mean? And,
I think I'm the elder here, unfortunately.
Well, okay. Well, maybe a little bit. You're a little older. Okay, I'll give you that. But I mean, still, I mean, I like this Beharit cover is etched in my head. The Incantation cover is etched in my head.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. I feel like that's why his work is so important. That's why I mentioned him here, because we were doing this, like we're involved in the scene at the same time, and he had a different kind of client base than me, but I still always loved his stuff, and it's been cool to like interact with him on occasion, over the decades, and he's like the godfather of black metal art,
Yeah,
I'm not sure 100%. I picked up on this before, but for the Beharit album cover, the title of the album is in the font Hobo.
Yes.
And I just want to note that, like, you have to be incredibly skilled to make the font Hobo look menacing at all.
Really, just really confident, really sure of yourself.
Like he's managing to pull off a number of typographic sins.
Yeah,
with Plum.
That could have been the label. Who knows?
I mean, like, regardless, like, you can't just slap Hobo on something and have it like actually look iconic and menacing unless you are at this level, which is very cool.
That's very true. Yeah. Anyhow, again, nothing super deep or meaningful here, other than like there's just a historical aspect to Chris's work that I think deserves a wealthy amount of respect.
Oh, sweet. Well, I'm pooped, man. It was quite the marathon.
Holy cow.
Hey, that was a ton of fun, though. I appreciate all you guys carving out some time on this Saturday. I don't know when I'm going to release this, but this happens to be a Saturday.
Yeah, you might have to do some parts, man.
Yeah.
Be a two-parter. I was going to say, Lee, one of the things I do appreciate about the really long format of of your show is that it is one of the easiest things for me to put on while I'm drawing.
Yeah.
Like, because I'm not going to have to find something else for the next 2 or 3 hours, which I really fucking love. It's like kind of, I don't know. I sometimes struggle to find something to listen to when I don't necessarily want to put on music, and I hate having to find something new every 28 minutes or so. So I've been listening to all the back episodes of this the last couple of the last month or so, because I don't have to like switch it up, and then it's kind of just relaxing to hear people just shoot the shit about metal art.
This is an interesting format too. I feel like doing the panel thing and being able to even myself being able to learn about all these other artists who I would normally never be exposed to, and I think there's something great and positive to find in different people's expressions. People who are doing something outside of what you normally do. It's nice and refreshing to have that, and to have even just to talk about it. Why something is working well as a piece of art, even though it's not something you might necessarily seek out all the time. So to me, this is a very enlightening and fun experience. So I appreciate you hosting and coordinating it all.
Yeah, for sure. It's been also a pleasure just to see, like, to Mark's point, what different people gravitated towards.
Yeah. And
just like knowing everybody else's work, being able to point to like shared influences or, different, just like different kind of thematic content.
I think it speaks a lot to the past that each of us have had as artists. Some of these artists that we presented today, it has to do, I think, a lot with what's informed our own work in sort of a roundabout way, whether philosophical or stylistically. And I think it's good for people to see that. It's also cool hanging out with you guys too, because I'm familiar with everybody's work, but to be able to actually experience you virtually, if you will, it's fun. How often do we get to do this? I'm like a lot of us are probably at our drawing tables and inking away or busy with family and stuff like that. That we're not afforded this kind of time to communicate and critique together or to appreciate something together. So I again, another reason to thank you, Lee, for having us on here.
Yeah, I can't think of an opportunity like this.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know about you guys, but it does get a little lonely at the drawing desk sometimes.
Well, yeah, it's a solitary activity. It's not like being in a band.
Yeah, right. And it's like
you're hiding in your corner.
And it's like, that's why I'm like I will put this on because it's a great friendship simulator. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, I got some friends who like know what's up, talking to me while I'm working in the corner.
It gives you other stuff to think about too.
Yeah. But just how relatable hearing, because I've watched all of your interviews with Lee, your discussions with him, and there's always it's so reassuring to hear everybody having the same struggles and the same experiences that I've had. It's easy to relate to that, and it's nice to know that you're right. You do have friends who have similar experiences, even if they're simulated friends or whatever you want to call it.
Look, we're all very real. I don't know what you're talking about.
I think I am. I don't know.
We're getting real Baudrillard up in here.
I might be just a simulacrum. I'm not sure.
No, I enjoy. I always enjoy talking art, so it's pretty awesome. And of course, always talking about metal land art. That's always that's always. And I gotta be honest, and this is gonna make you feel weird. It's weird that Mark is here. Mark, I've known your artwork for like a long time. I'm gonna make you like super uncomfortable.
You're a legend, man.
Yeah, it's fucking weird. It's like, oh shit, that's Riddick.
Yeah, same thing. It's like I've been looking at Mark's work for like well over 10 years now.
Right.
And
I think even longer. It's like, yeah, there he is.
I don't know. It's not. I feel like we're all in the same boat. I don't think about those kinds of things, like how long.
I know that's why I like making you uncomfortable, because I know it's how we are as artists. It's weird to get compliments and things, but you made my upbringing in music cooler, so that's awesome. So give the flowers to you while you can. And so when tomorrow you're doing your normal domestic things with your wife and kids, just remember, hey, some guy actually thinks my stuff's pretty cool.
I'm just glad that it's so fucking hot out, because otherwise I would have been able to wear a shirt that has a logo that Mark did with a drawing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, 100%.
I'm just saying I could have worn my Glorious Depravity shirt if it
now
was.
I just noticed one thing.
Nice
belt.
Yeah, the Rustin belts. Yeah. So I'm finishing up a piece, and it literally has skulls.
Dude, that's awesome.
Hold on a second.
And titties.
It's cool. I have against the format.
I'm telling you, I'm not like ribbing you or anything like that. I think it's an amazing descriptor
for like a specific type of art that like
I'm not. Hey, it's exactly it's exactly what people pay me for. So I'm really good at it at this point.
It's just usually the shorthand where if somebody comes to me and they're like, "This is what we want," I'm like, "I'm not. I can send you to a lot of other people." But if you want
skulls and titties
vibe, you're going to get upsetting skulls and titties.
It was just wild. I was looking. I was like, oh shit, they're literally right next to each other. That's awesome.
I mean, in fairness, like who amongst us?
I'm not ashamed by it. I think it's a great descriptor. I think it's awesome. I'm seriously gonna use it all the time now.
It's funny too because since I listened to the episode, Caroline, I've been like almost on a weekly basis, been like, yeah, but I kind of like skulls and titties. So I don't know.
I mean, they're like
there's something wrong with me.
Building blocks for they're elemental. I just like I know that.
And then I just noticed like all the art that I was showing was more of that.
But like you were showing like the shit that really like set the tone for a lot of that stuff.
I guess. I mean, sure, but I was like, oh shit, I like, really do. Most of the art is
go for Brahm, man. Like that.
Yeah, dude liked it. Yeah, there's no doubt there.
Dude liked it, but dude could do it in a way.
That's true. That's fair.
It feels like his artwork always felt like he like lived it somehow. You know what I mean? Like
it was epic.
You know what I mean? There was something super convincing about the way.
Oh, we got frozen.
Oh no, he froze. I was like, what? He left me hanging.
No, but like the lady in the throne that you picked out is one of my favorites.
The succubus one, yeah.
Oh, she's like the look on her face. She's just like. There's dude in that, but just like.
And then he started writing books, and that's he's back.
Dude.
So you all went away, like you all went away too. I was like, are we still here? What's going on?
Yeah. We were still here.
Probably my shitty.
You froze, but we just were like Brahm.
So all the friendship simulation just crashed.
Gave up.
It's crashed. Yeah. It's fine. There's. My little sim like walked into a corner and couldn't get out.
We can stay on for a second.
Oh, we're still live.
Oh yeah.
Oh shit. Okay.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have blown all that smoke up Mark's ass if I knew that we were still being recorded. Shit.
Oh no, that definitely.
No, that is on now. Recorded for all.
I can't have that go public. No, I'm kidding.
Well, if you made it to this point, thanks for tuning into the first panel episode. I'm sure I'm going to do something similar again. It's been a real blast. Be on the lookout. Likewise. And I'm going to put everybody's Instagram and website links in the bio. We got Mark Riddick, Caroline Harrison, Jerry Wyrmwalk, and Shoggoth Kinetics, Lucas. But yeah, until next time, see you guys. You guys stay on.
Thanks, Lee.
See you guys.